Hello everyone, this is part 21 of What If Naruto Was the Perfect Shinobi, and I hope you guys enjoy this video and to like, to subscribe, to share, and check out the playlist, to see more comment down below. Now let's start the intro.
They call me a god. They call me a god. They call me a god.
Join my membership, the perks are great. It's in the description. Be sure to like and subscribe, it gives me more motivation. Enjoy. Naruto's vision swam as he awoke, a roaring headache pounding in his ears. The ailing blonde groaned and tried to stand, stumbling and dropping back onto the large bed. His whisker-marked cheek impacted against something warm and pliable, and Naruto mumbled something incomprehensible as he rolled to the side, now looking into the white ceiling as the carpet tickled his N. His initial thought was that he had been slipped something and taken prisoner, and that his captors would be along soon to interrogate him. Lemme sleep, brat, we can do that later. Uzumaki Naruto blinked a moment and his lidded gaze widened in recognition as he heard a garbled, mumbled voice next to him. The Jinchuriki gathered his bearings enough to sit, grimacing at the slick wetness on the mattress he'd been sleeping on as he noted that whatever the strange, pungent substance was, his spiked hair was now covered in it, and looked over to his companion. Mitarashi Anko was laid out on her back stark N, breathing light snores in and out as she slept. Naruto's attention was drawn to her heaving chest, which moved in time with her respiration. The container tore his gaze loose with a recriminating scowl, standing again as Anko rolled over to where he was sitting, not caring to be smothered beneath her and not wanting to see what he'd been resting against a moment earlier. Taking a second, longer look at the gorgeous older woman, Naruto glimpsed countless scars marking her light tanned skin, evidence that she had seen combat on innumerable occasions throughout her career. The blonde recognized a newer one on her side as the kunai wound she had received at Orochimaru's hands a month or so earlier, and also saw some harsh purple bruises in a ringed pattern around her N, like she had been strangled. What a mess, I knew I shouldn't have gone along with that crazy bee's schemes. And indeed, there was a mess. The apartment, Anko's he assumed, was a complete dump. Her expensive-looking beige carpets were littered with emptied liquor bottles, as well as various takeout containers that indicated that she and Naruto were about on the same level as pertained to cooking. Piled in with the mess were clothes, both the previous night's as well as several other garments, and countless magazines and books, including a near-complete Ika series that proved Anko's perverse nature to be on par with Konoha's most notorious males, were piled high in a corner near the restroom. Naruto snorted in disapproval as he gathered his clothes and prowled towards the bathroom, much too absorbed in the nosebleed-inducing memories that were now rushing back into his mind to notice that the light was on and the water running inside. You're awake? Good. I didn't want to leave without a word to someone. Naruto started when he reached the entrance, beginning to summon his armed snakes almost on instinct. The Jinchuriki exhaled and leaned against the entrance when Inuzuka Hana looked over towards him. She was barebared and wet, wearing nothing except her spandex shorts, allowing the blonde a good look at her generous curves when she moved to regard him. The older teenager's tunin vest was hanging loose over Anko's porcelain toilet and the wall mirror she was standing next to was misted over. The air inside the small room was like a moist haze, indicating that she had taken a shower and was still changing back into her clothes. The blonde crossed his arms with a careless shrug, still too hazed with sake to be embarrassed about the scene. Naruto had seen that much and a whole lot more the previous night. You don't have to leave at all. I'd rather not be stuck here alone with Anko, thanks. Hana smirked and leaned in to kiss his cheek, causing him to blush. Still, neither the kiss nor the enticing view he had at the moment caused even the slightest stirring in Naruto's loins, which ached as though someone had taken a hammer to his sack. And he wouldn't have put something like that past Anko, either. That's sweet, but I need to check in back home soon or else mom's gonna have a litter. Kiba's quite enough in the sibling department, thanks. The Inuzuka girl's warm mouth lingered a moment, and she rubbed his N as she pulled back, turning again and reaching over to grab her vest. Naruto slid into the bathroom behind her and glanced at his image in the mirror. He too was stark N, wearing nothing except some stained boxer shorts and Anko's N lace. The blonde's expression was pale and sunken, his gaze bloodshot owing to all the sake he'd consumed the previous evening. Naruto's bandages looked a little worn as well. There was a small pinkish smudge showing through over his wound, indicating that it had opened a little at some point or another. He groaned and massaged his temples when Hana spoke her brother's name, his plight seeming to resonate with the residual sake rumbling in his gut. TCH, Kiba, that reminds me. Screwing around with Anko was bad enough. That experience alone would be enough to give Naruto nightmares. But messing around with the mutt's sister was much worse. He'd been around Kiba long enough to know that the animal trainer was more than a little protective when it came to his relations. His pack-oriented mindset guaranteed as much. You're worried about how he's gonna take this? Naruto nodded, wondering how she in the hell she could be so casual about this mess. For the Kami's sake, he was her little brother's teammate. Or ex-teammate, whatever. The Jinchuriki ran a hand through his blonde hair, as he was known to do when agitated. Hana leaned back against him, pressing her bare back against his torso and pillowing her head into his shoulder. Naruto inhaled a shuddering breath, smelling a strong pine needle aroma in her brown hair and unable to tell whether it was her natural scent, or something in the shampoo she'd used. He breathed out again with a sigh, and leaned his head onto Anko's medicine cabinet. There's not the slightest chance his nose won't notice what happened here and that I was involved with it. Hana snorted and rolled her shoulders against the blonde's bandaged chest. The Inuzuka's still moist skin brushing against Naruto sent a spark through his nerve endings. She then grabbed at a comb on the cluttered sink counter and tried to wipe the condensation on the mirror clear to brush her hair, but the mist seemed determined to remain. Hana slapped the brush back down on the counter with a growl. Whether it was meant towards the mirror or Kiba, the Jinchuriki couldn't be sure. F him, then. I'm a big girl, and I don't need that useless runt's permission to have a good time. He'll get mad, but there isn't he can do about it. Naruto almost chuckled, amused to note that Kiba wasn't the sole Inuzuka with a sewer mouth. That's nice and all, but you're not the one he's gonna be pissed with. Hana squirmed in the tight quarters and kissed the blonde's tea, nibbling on the lump. Trust me, Kiba knows better than to mess with me. I'm his big sister. That means I've got enough blackmail material to make him behave. Failing that, I can kick his little ass. This time, he did let out a laugh as the girl disengaged and leaned back over the sink, wringing out her hair. Once that was done, Hana twisted it into one large braid and tossed it over her shoulder, then putting on her top and zipping the vest to its usual place. You are his sister, I've got no doubts about that now. The Inuzuka reached over to the sink again to take her hair tie, but rammed her elbow into the blonde's bandaged wound in the process. Contact with the sharp bone was all that was needed to make the sensitive puncture gush blood, and so it did, turning the light pink spot on his bandages a wet crimson. Naruto hissed and raised a hand to the complaining spot. Hana turned about to apologize, but her expression narrowed into a sharp glare at his unkempt wrappings. I don't know who the hell did these, but whoever it was needs a hole stomped in them. Naruto's bandages were stained with sweat, and he would admit that he wasn't the best at medical exercises. The Jinchuriki had never needed to care about it, given his enhanced regeneration. That his demonic healing would ever stop working or the idea that he might need to know how to treat a wounded teammate was something that would have never even crossed the blonde's mind back when he should have been learning how. That previous Naruto would have snorted and abandoned someone careless enough to get hurt in combat to their own devices. I guess I should have paid more attention to those triage lessons at school. The girl ran a smooth hand along his tainted wrappings and shook her head while opening Anko's medicine cabinet, grumbling at the unappealing sight. Males, so irresponsible, lie down on the ground and hold still. Naruto stared at her a short moment, but relented and plopped down onto the warm tile. The container kept his blue gaze locked on the Inuzuka's hand in the medicine cabinet, arching a blonde brow when she produced a kunai. Trust Anko to store weapons in such a place. And odder still was that Hana had guessed to look there. The canine kunoiki bent to a knee and through the wrappings with the kunai, exposing the angered, seeping puncture beneath. There seemed to be a violent red tinge around the LD tissue. Not as bad as it looks, believe me. For some reason, Naruto was compelled to respond to the girl's disapproving stare. Be quiet, idiot. I need to concentrate here. Hana made a couple slow hand seals, and her outstretched right palm began glowing with a brilliant green light. When she touched her palm to his wound, the tissue hissed and crackled, steaming as the blonde's cellular mitosis accelerated countless times over to stch the shredded skin back together. A strange, sterile smell permeated in the restroom's moist air. The Inuzuka exhaled a hot breath and pushed back to a standing position once her medical procedure was complete, using the higher vantage point to examine the spot. Hana motioned the Jinchuriki to stand again once she was through inspecting her work. Naruto rubbed the rough-healed tissue as he rose, skin smarting with an intense stinging sensation, though he took a more curious interest in the procedure. I've never been healed with medical ninjutsu, it's an interesting experience. The blonde reached out above his head and used the wet sink as a brace as he pulled back into a standing position. The steam in the bathroom had subsided somewhat. Naruto looked down at his hand on the counter when he touched against something thick on the sink, and stared in disgust at the open toothpaste tube squirted along the porcelain among various other toiletries. The Jinchuriki wondered how someone could even tolerate living in such squalor, shaking his spiked blonde head as he turned on the water and wiped his palm with a washcloth. I couldn't prevent scarring since it was so deep and swollen, but at least it's healed over now. Naruto looked into the mirror, which was still misted over with warm condensate but not so much as it had been earlier, and traced a thumb along the huge, twisted star-shaped mark now located over his heart. The container smirked into the mirror and rapped against the calloused tissue with his knuckles. Hana continued to watch him as she returned Anko's kunai to its proper storage place. I like it, this'll serve as a memento. A battle like that deserves to be remembered. The incredulous glare Naruto received in return told him that his comment might not have been the wisest. You shouldn't even be alive right now. That S went straight through a vital point. Naruto shrugged, not caring to reveal too much about his unique abilities to the older girl as he put his clothes back on and slid past Hana again into Anko's bedroom. The blonde could see the sunlight outside peeking through the closed blinds, bright enough to indicate that it was late in the morning outside. The Jinchuriki stretched his muscled arms as he moved into the carpeted room, standing on the rare place where he could see said carpet underneath all the trash littered about. Naruto winced as he stepped on a near-emptied sweet bean soup can, splashing the residual contents inside onto his pants leg. He sensed Hana's lingering stare on his back, and glanced back with a tired smirk to see her standing in the door with her arms crossed under her chest. I have a resilient constitution, that's all. Resilient was a gross understatement, as he demon had somehow regenerated a lost heart on the spot. That makes no sense whatsoever. Naruto was saved making a more complex explanation when Anko's alarm clock rang loud in the cavernous bedroom. The blonde lowered his head on instinct, and the clock went crashing into the wall a second later, shattering into several mechanical bits and making a large dent in the plaster. The drunken and Anko on the bed grunted in an irritated stupor and rolled back over to go to sleep once again, pulling the covers over her now that no one else was there to pin him against the mattress. Naruto and Hana both looked at the snake kunoiki and then stared at one another and blinked. Kiba's sister crouched down and grabbed the broken clock, swearing as she gazed at the now motionless hands. It's even later than I thought. I've gotta get going. Hana strode over to the window and opened the blinds, allowing the sun's light to stream in and brighten Anko's bedroom, and opened it wide to let in the clean morning air. The blonde teenager likewise moved in closer to the window, more than willing to escape the impure, brothel-like stench in the room. Stale and mid-grade booze didn't mix so well inside his sensitive nose, and his semi-intoxicating haze was beginning to subside enough so that he couldn't help but notice it. The Inuzuka medic meanwhile straddled the windowsill, one leg perched inside the room and the other resting against the concrete ground outside the apartment. Hana seemed to be about to duck through the opening and leave, but she stopped and took one last glance back over her shoulder. I had a nice time. I'll be around later. And tell Anko-san I said thanks, too, please. Naruto tilted his head as the older teenager swung her other toned leg over the sill and escaped through the window. The canine girl leapt over the guardrail and rappelled against the concrete staircase, bonding down several stories to the ground below. The blonde Jinchuriki leaned against the sill and watched in silence as the chocolate-haired Inuzuka vanished down the street at a brisk pace, headed towards her clan's compound. A loud snore shattered his reverie, and Naruto swiveled his head to see the sleeping Anko slam a pillow over her head to block the encroaching sunlight. He almost sneered at the sight. A grown woman wrapped in covers and buried under a pillow, sleeping in a bedroom that could have been mistaken as a swine burrow. TCH, like some obnoxious kid, sometimes I wonder which of us is the older. The blonde decided to leave his ex-sensei to her sleep. Naruto had no real interest in being around when Anko awoke nursing a vicious hangover, nor did the demon carrier believe that she would want him there. The snake Kunoichi was no more inclined to sentimental cuddling than the blonde Anbu corporal would have been. And Naruto still couldn't quite accept that he had done that with her either. He wasn't angered about what had happened so much, though he supposed some might have argued that he had some right to be. Naruto had been a willing participant, intoxicated though he had been, and had never been one to blame his own mistakes on others. Still, he didn't want to be hanging around when Anko awoke, as being there would be to acknowledge that what he'd done with her and with the mutt's sister was something more than a ridiculous lapse in common sense. Even so, it's not like I hated it or something, what a mess. Naruto's voiced thought carried through the silent apartment as he closed the wooden door behind his exit. The living room and kitchen were somewhat cleaner than the restroom and bedroom, though still a cluttered nightmare to the blonde's standards. Though the Jinchuriki could be a monster in combat, he was possessed with an almost neurotic obsession with cleanliness in his modest home. Naruto couldn't even begin to understand how someone could accept living in like Anko seemed to, but the Anbu couldn't stand it much longer. Running a hand through his hair, the container began to make towards the apartment door, but he stopped to peruse his ex-teacher's videotape collection as he passed an open cabinet, having no idea what possessed him to do so. No surprises here, action thrillers, monster movies, cheap karate flicks, and there were also some tapes labeled in Anko's own writing, as Naruto recognized her scrawl while shaking his head at the knowledge that her taste in movies was almost as regrettable as the mutt's. At least she doesn't watch those Princess Fuin movies like that numbskull. Indeed, Naruto knew Kiba's most embarrassing secret, that he maintained a small shrine dedicated to the lead actress in those lame movies in his room at the Inuzuka compound. The mutt had coerced the Jinchuriki into watching one installment in the theaters a while back, and he would never watch another. Turning back to the strange tapes, Naruto noticed that Kurenai's name was on one. The container almost popped that one into the VCR to investigate, but he decided on mid-reach that he didn't even want to know what might be on Mitarashi Anko's home videos, nor did he care to risk rousing her with the noise. Naruto shook his head and continued towards the exit, sparing one last lingering glance towards the snake Kunoichi's room as he went. Whatever his relationship with the purple-haired woman had once been, he knew that it had gone through a change that could never be reversed, and he wasn't prepared to meet those consequences right then. First, I need a hot bath and some time to think, damn this hangover. XXXXXXXXXXX. The rain pounded down onto his back in a drenching torrent, lightning crackled in his vision and thunder boomed in his ears. Uchiha Sasuke glanced around the tangling wood, panting hard with exhaustion. Ruined trees littered the landscape around him, but his attention was concentrated on his own bloodstained hand, the pale skin charred and cut in places where his Chidori had LD through the sand Kunoichi's weapon. The mentioned girl, named Temari as the Sharingan wielder recalled, lie prone in the coarse mud, ked in a most gruesome manner. Sasuke experienced some strange deja vu as he gazed down at the butchered Kunoichi, and turned his back to the scene with a shudder. You complete bastard. That Tessen was an heirloom. The Uchiha whirled back about and stared in shock as the girl rose, metal shards still piercing into her skin glistening in the relentless rain. Her listless green orbs came alive again as she slammed the broken weapon closed and charged, intent on battering the raven-haired shinobi's skull in. Sasuke tried to move to dodge, but his water-saturated limbs wouldn't respond to his mind's commands. As the blonde-haired girl closed in, a humongous grand fireball emerged in her blind side, incinerating her on the point. Sasuke glanced towards the attack's origin point, but saw nothing there in the blinding rain. A short moment later, an emotionless voice sounded behind him. Foolish little brother. You cannot even handle something as simple as that even now. Sasuke grimaced and turned about, staring straight into his sociopath brother's evolved Sharingan. Uchiha Itachi looked much the same as he had that terrible night, clad in his Anbu combat apparel without the mask. The elder brother was standing so close within striking distance that Sasuke could smell him through the mud's overpowering earthen odor, arms at his side with a blank, expressionless visage. And still, Sasuke's own Sharingan could see the subtle arrogance in the stoic teenager, as though Itachi wouldn't acknowledge that his worthless little brother could ever harm him, thus he was willing to stand so close without being armed or in a combat stance. The raven-hard Uchiha snarled and pulled out a kunai, regaining control over his movement in his blinding rage and lashing out at his brother's chilled heart while Itachi made no attempt to move or block. The kunai struck home, but rather than bleeding out, the elder Uchiha disintegrated into ravens. The black M scattered about overhead in silence and then reorganized. Itachi stood impassive once more, leveling his brother with the same stare. You coward. Your hatred is still much too meager, Ototo. You will never be able to K me like this. Sasuke screamed in anger and leapt into the air, launching a shuriken barrage at Itachi while beginning to seal a ninjutsu. His brother dissolved into black ravens once again. This time, however, the squawking M rushed straight towards Sasuke, blinding his vision and making him lose his concentration as he landed hard in the mud. The rain ceased overhead as the Konoha nin swatted at the birds, and a sick acrid stench met Sasuke's nostrils as the merciless ravens scattered and he regained his sight. The Uchiha blinked and looked about his surroundings. Sasuke was no longer in the woods, but instead in an even less welcome place, his childhood home. The mud had changed a crimson color. Rotting blood as thick and coarse as wet cement covered the wooden ground he remembered, staining his hands as he sat on his knees. Itachi was now nowhere to be seen, and there seemed to be nothing outside the room's window except a pitch-black void. Sasuke shook his head and stared at the ground in brooding silence, and saw his mother there prone in the crimson mess, also looking the same as she had that night, the lethal sword wound that Itachi's katana had created piercing her be. So beautiful, even in death, mother, I'm sorry, to see you defiled so is more than I can stand. A low, mocking whistle interrupted Sasuke's lamentations. The Uchiha's visage morphed into hatred, knowing who the intruder was without even needing to look. The Sharingan wielder did so regardless, and wasn't in the least surprised to see a certain blonde-haired brute that had no business inside Sasuke's ancestral home leaning against the near wall with his arms crossed at his chest, leering down at his mother. Uzumaki Naruto's mouth was twisted into a condescending sneer, an expression that Sasuke had come to equate with him, and was wearing that worn, blood-stained trench coat with a cheap katana girded and dangling at his side. Your mom was quite the looker, Sasu-chan. And to think she would give birth to something so miserable, what a waste. Sasuke glared up at the arrogant blonde bastard, Sharingan blazing so hot that it stung. That was the last insult, Uzumaki. The Uchiha averted his crimson gaze towards the mantle, pleased to see his household's katana still in its proper place. Sasuke leapt into the wall, using his chakra to hold there as he exposed the masterpiece sword and rushed at Uzumaki, whose sneer broadened into an insane beaming grin as he beckoned him with a come-hither gesture while taking his own weapon in the other hand. The two katana clashed and sparks rained down. Naruto pressed the attack and maintained his own pace, but Sasuke's Sharingan-based insight allowed him to predict and intercept the sword swipes with surprising ease. Uzumaki made a rather poor swordsman in the Uchiha's opinion, swinging his blade around like an oni would his club. The blonde was all power and no SK. The swords met and locked. Sasuke's skill and positioning allowed him to break even with Naruto's much superior raw strength. You know, I was hanging around when Itachi-san did it all, I thought it was hilarious. Naruto's statement caused Sasuke's guard to slacken a moment, which was all the lowborn bastard needed to regain the advantage. Uzumaki shoved Sasuke into the wall hard, causing him to lose his grip on his blade, and came charging in to end the battle. The Sharingan prophesied that he would utilize a low S, and the Uchiha leapt over his blonde nemesis's attack when it came, causing Naruto's blade to impale into the wall. Uzumaki growled and wrestled it loose with a speed that surprised Sasuke a bit, but the harsh tug caused him to stumble backwards, swinging the blade wild as it pulled out. Sasuke retook his blade and moved into where Naruto's momentum carried him, and let loose with a precision swing that tore clean into the blonde's zen. His expression was plastered in utter shock as his head rolled to the ground. His beheaded corpse sank to its knees and then slumped over, mixing Naruto's blood into the pre-existing mess on the ground. You're as disgusting as Itachi, a deviant and a disgrace to the honored Uchiha name. Sasuke whirled and stared down at the severed head in shock. Rather than Uzumaki Naruto's spiked blonde, its hair was now a metallic color that the Sharingan uses memories. The head turned, and Uchiha Fugaku's cold, stern expression leveled his second son with an accusing glare. Father, no, I didn't mean to. Sasuke was close to tears when a gentle hand tugged at the hem on his training shorts. Avenger looked down in shocked horror to see that his mother was now impaled onto the katana he still held within his hand. The ancestral blade penetrated into Uchiha Mikoto's B at the exact identical spot that Itachi's had during the M. His mother's other hand gripped the blade, in an attempt to push the weapon loose. I'm so heartbroken, to know that we would be made twice over, Sasuke-chan. Tears began rolling down Sasuke's cheeks, as reliving this perpetual nightmare as the perpetrator became more than he could take. Mother, please. At that moment, a blinding pain resonated in Sasuke's chest, as he saw a katana blade piercing into him, originating at his back. A rough hand wrenched into his raven hair and pulled him to stand once more, L back on his head to allow him to see his attacker. Uzumaki Naruto's headless corpse had risen, and at the stump on his a new head began to emerge, almost like a wounded serpent regenerating its lost tail. Naruto's spiked golden locks and prominent whisker marks were still there, but the expression he wore was not the blonde's own. The look showed nothing but emptiness, something Sasuke recognized at once as being his brother's. Foolish little Sasuke-chan. You could never hope to conquer me. The composite being raised Sasuke, still impaled on the katana, and slammed him hard into the wall, pinning him in place. The Avenger stared with muted shock into that blank look as his cur raised Sasuke's own katana in his other hand, bringing it down in a king arc towards his head. Sasuke-kun. Sasuke gasped at the unexpected voice, and his entire world went white when the Uchiha regained consciousness a moment later. He was slumped on a rock at Team 7's normal training grounds with the morning sun beating down on him, pale as death and pouring cold sweat with his heart pounding twice its normal rate. The Uchiha blinked several times to acclimate to the sudden light, realizing that he must have gone to sleep while absorbed in his usual morning meditation. The would-be Avenger hadn't gotten much rest ever since the invasion. That Suna kunoiki he had bested in combat continued to haunt his waking moments non-stop, as the whole gruesome K had been recorded without his wanting it in photogenic detail with the Sharingan, branded clear into his memories in the harshest manner conceivable. What I wouldn't give to be able to forget, at least Kakashi keeps his covered. The Uchiha clan's dojutsu could be called a double-edged sword in some sense, as the countless terrible acts one had to commit as a shinobi were rendered so much tougher to ignore or create some emotional barrier against. The advantages that the Sharingan provided in combat were obvious, but not quite so apparent to the envious outside complainers around with the mental and emotional complications that crippled those who relied on the dojutsu, stresses that could push a man to madness over time. People had long whispered that the Uchiha clan's power was cursed, but there were more valid reasons to rationalize the phenomenon, when one looked at it with a logical perspective. In the end, not even an inherited power comes without its own price. I suppose that's sound logic. Sasuke exhaled and shook out the mental cobwebs, much more exhausted than he had been prior to his unwanted catnap. As the Uchiha tried to stand and met with a gentle resistance, he recognized the gentle hand wiping his brow with a wet cloth, as well as the pink-haired kunoiki doing the action. While under most normal circumstances the stoic Uchiha would have brushed her touch aside and repulsed her helping hand with no hesitation, as haggard as he was now living in this perpetual nightmare, racked with convulsing phantom pains in his right hand and elsewhere, Sasuke could pocket his personal pride enough to admit that he valued the kind gesture, even though he might never come right out and tell her so. Sakura. When she saw that he was awake and coherent, Sasuke's kunoiki teammate held out a metal thermos that was warm to the touch when he accepted it. The raven-haired genius murmured his thanks as he unscrewed the black plastic lid and took a long chug, savoring Sakura's herbal tea as the medicinal brew cascaded down his tea and cut through his nerve-wrecking exhaustion like a sharp blade as the liquid pulled in his stomach. You were having another nightmare. That's the third time this week, Sasuke-kun. Night terrors were nothing new to Uchiha Sasuke, who had been coping with them on a regular basis ever since his brother's Holocaust, but never since that hellish time had he experienced such emotional horrors as had plagued him in these recent nights. Sasuke made an attempt to look at his teammate, but shuddered on meeting her emerald gaze. Those green orbs made the genius once again remember the blonde sand kunoiki he had ked in those woods, even though the pink-haired girls were lighter and lacked the Suna girls' experienced tempered hardness, and that simple recollection brought the K rushing back into his memories. The Sharingan wielder swallowed more tea, concentrating on the brew's bitter taste and pungent aroma in an attempt to cast the images aside. Yeah, but I'm all right now. Let me stand. Sakura opened her mouth to protest but reconsidered, knowing well that it was pointless to even bother arguing with Sasuke. The raven-haired Uchiha wasn't one to allow someone else's opinion change his mind. He was too stubborn, and his pride wouldn't let him accept being overruled. Sasuke waited until she removed her hand and stood, peeling loose his soaked shirt and placing it on the warming rock. Sakura placed the cloth in the grass and glanced at her wristwatch, scowling towards the villagers she took in the time. Kakashi-sensei's late again. That man is so irresponsible, I swear. Thinking about their late teacher made Sasuke's blood roil. Kakashi was out squirreling in the village somewhere, when the Uchiha needed to get back into a normal training routine. His problems would begin to solve themselves, he believed, as soon as he had something to keep him occupied. All the mandated leisure time since the invasion had made Sasuke stew in his personal issues, and had made him ever more susceptible to the nightmares and visions. He'd made an attempt to train alone, but that had served little real constructive purpose and had soon brought him right back to the same problem. You're bleeding, Sasuke-kun, come here and let me bandage those. The black-haired shinobi looked down at his hands, which were chalk white and oozing crimson where his nails had pushed into his palms. He had clenched them too hard in his impotent rage. Sasuke considered snubbing his concerned teammate once more, but he was still planning on getting in his training whenever the erratic sensei chose to grace his students with his presence, and he would need to have his hands in proper working order. Sasuke scowled as he abandoned his previous place leaning against the painted wooden practice pole and marched over to his teammate, shoving his hands out with an unspoken command to be quick about wrapping them. You seem serious about becoming a medic, nin. While Sasuke was raging against the pole, Sakura had reached into her backpack and removed several advanced medical scrolls and texts. The Sharingan user knew all about her sudden obsession with medical ninjutsu, having been with her in Shino's hospital room when she had expressed her intentions, and understood and even respected the reasoning behind it as well, even though the path was still one he would never even consider choosing. Uchiha were warriors, never healers, and there was the clan's vengeance to consider as well. Sakura on the other hand did have the precise chakra control one needed to excel in the medical arts. Sasuke recalled Kakashi's tree climbing and water walking exercises months earlier, the sole times she had ever managed to beat him out in training, as he glanced down at the complex diagram on an open scroll. Aha, but the hospital won't accept me into their training program until I've made Chunin. Kakashi-sensei brought me these texts to work with until then. That explained the resources, which shouldn't have been something a genin-level kunoichi without a clan would have had. Kakashi had looked at Sakura with an almost beaming pride when she had expressed an interest in medicine, though Sasuke had suspected that he was looking through her more than at her, as though remembering someone else in her. The Uchiha thought it peculiar that his sensei would have such books in his own possession, though he supposed Kakashi would have more than enough pull to retrieve whatever materials he wanted. Then we'll have to make sure we pass the exams next time around. Sasuke's senses pricked, and he whirled about to see someone coming. The Uchiha's lip curled in dislike on seeing Inuzuka Kiba stomping along into the training ground with his little mutt on his head. Uzumaki's little lapdog was about the last person Sasuke wanted to have hanging around, save the mongrel's whisker-marked keeper. Kiba's bestial expression narrowed as he looked between Sasuke and Sakura, who looked at him with a curious expression while wrapping the raven-haired genin's hands. He hadn't been expecting to see Team 7, it seemed. Sasuke stared back at him a long moment, and when it became rather obvious that the slow-witted ass wasn't going to recognize that he'd made some mistake and leave them, the Sharingan wielder endeavored to speed the process along. TCH, wrong grounds, mongrel, this is our team's training spot. Get lost. Kiba stormed over and glowered at Sasuke, standing close enough that the Uchiha had to experience his unpleasant bestial odor. Kurenai-sensei told me to report right here, Sasuke. She said we were having some special training. Y'all are the ones who need to take a hike, cause we're using this spot. Sasuke's mouth opened to retort, but a sarcastic voice sounded out above them. Now children, behave. I can explain this awkward little situation. All three genin looked over to where Kakashi stood atop the training pole, perverted book in hand, Kiba with a mulish expression as he realized he'd been somehow misled. Sasuke sneered and pointed at the steaming mongrel, as Sakura wrapped the last bandages on his palms. A little blood seeped past the wrappings, but nothing that might impede his using them. Kakashi, send this stinking animal back to his kennel so we can train. Kakashi's lips quirked into an unpleasant smile beneath his mask, something that Sasuke had learned meant nothing good. He's going to be working with us. We're short-handed a member with Shino in the hospital, so I've asked Kurenai-sensei to let us borrow her student while he recovers. This was news to the Inuzuka, as the shook his head and turned to leave the clearing. For his part, Sasuke wasn't sure that Shino would recover. The poison that bastard Kankuro had used against the Aburame had ravaged him, burning out his chakra poured to such a large extent that the medics at the hospital could do little to help him. Shino's Kikaichu had neutralized the toxin, killing themselves in the process, and were now rotting inside his Tenketsu network, which would soon enough do as much harm as the actual poison had. The Aburame was being kept in an induced coma and under a special preservation fuinjutsu while the healers worked to conceive some solution, but the prospects weren't good. Sasuke gave Sakura a sidelong glance, and saw that she had her own hands clenched even tighter than his had been earlier, though she wasn't bleeding. The hell with that, I'm outta here, I ain't being on a team with that weeping prick. Kiba indicated towards Sasuke with a rude gesture over his shoulder and began marching back to the village. Whatever working accord the two quick-tempered genin had managed to reach while rushing Shino to the hospital during the invasion had been lost. Sasuke wasn't all too enthusiastic about having Kiba on his team either, though he was pragmatic enough to recognize that Team 7 would need a substitute member, and the Sharingan wielder wasn't about to let the canine shinobi go without a parting shot. Mongrel scampers back home with his tail between his legs. You're not such a braggart now without Naruto to cower behind when things get serious, I guess. Kiba whirled back with his cheeks burning crimson, cracking his knuckles and preparing to come in swinging. Sasuke allowed a small smirk to cross his mouth, knowing that he'd nailed a sore point with the animal trainer. Hatake Kakashi stared down at the two teenagers with a severe expression, but made no move to get in between them. You've had worse things shoved between your legs, whore. Put some damn clothes on. Kiba stopped his advance at the rock and snatched Sasuke's shirt, emblazoned on the back with the Uchiha clan's standard, scrunching the garment into a loose ball and slinging the ball into the ground. Sasuke scowled at the immature action and reached to retrieve it, but as soon as he touched it, something warm and yellow splashed onto both his shirt and his bandaged hand. Dog piss. That was more than he could take, as his dojutsu blazed active while a grinning Akamaru trotted back over to his master. Sasuke choked out a snarl and leapt at Kiba, while the Inuzuka growled and seized back an arm to meet the Uchiha's charge. Neither genin landed a blow, however, as Kakashi materialized between them and intercepted both attacks, rooting both Sasuke and Kiba in place as a massive aura rolled over them. I can see that teamwork is going to be an issue here. Well, I've got a solution. The proud Uchiha warrior shivered inside, sweat starting to coalesce on his brow. Sasuke hadn't experienced crippling king intent like this since Orochimaru. Not even that nutcase Gaara with his sealed Biju had compared. Kakashi was pissed. Sakura was also pale and shivering, and the silver-haired veteran hadn't even been targeting her with his presence. And soon enough Kakashi turned his attention towards his Kunoichi student, who was sitting on the ground silent with her medical texts open, and snapped at her as well. Put down the books, Sakura. You can read those at home. Given Kakashi's sour mood, Sakura wasn't about to argue and rushed to meet her instructor's commands, standing at attention next to Sasuke. Kiba's pupils were wide and shaking. That craven mongrel had been cowed into submission and wouldn't be complaining about his new assignment again. Moments passed, and Kakashi released his mental hold over the three genin and grinned beneath his mask, as though he hadn't even been serious to begin with, and snapped open a pocket on his shinobi vest. Sasuke released a long breath when he was allowed to move once more. Now then, we're going to have ourselves a little recreation. Sasuke and Sakura will remember this, I'm sure. Sasuke didn't need his Sharingan's insight to know what was looming, and still couldn't repress his groan when Kakashi produced two bells. XXXXXXXXXXX. Naruto leaned his head back against his bathtub's edge and sighed as he let the hot water seep into his aching limbs and counteract his roaring hangover. The Jinchuriki seldom bothered to spend time taking such luxurious soaks, tending to take quick showers and better use his time instead, but given his mandated downtime, he had chosen to indulge in a small treat on this particular occasion. There were no current missions to be completed, and he was in no general rush to train now, considering his eagerness to the previous sunset. The blonde was exhausted and somehow content as well. Naruto's relaxed euphoria came to a screeching halt, however, as the usual malevolent voice resounded within his mind. Yes, soak in the hot water like a fickle woman, it suits you well. Naruto sighed, not in the least wanting to converse with the impotent Biju. At some point or another, the tailed demon had become an irritation rather than a partner. The howling voice seemed to be a bit muted compared to normal, as though some other mechanism were containing the beast's powers more than the Shiki Fuan alone. There's nothing wrong with a little bath every now and then. I have to stay clean somehow. The container smirked as he cupped his hand and scooped some water to splash on his stomach seal, knowing that Kyubi no Kitsune could experience to a limited extent within his prison whatever touched the fuinjutsu binding him. Clean, far from it, engaging in such revolting debaucheries, imbibing and whoring like the worst of disgusting mortal trash. Rather than being cowed or apologetic, Naruto's mocking laugh resonated within the mindscape. That's funny, a being that obliterates whole countries for sport is a thing prude. Even with the stronger barrier that existed between them, the demon's burning anger made Naruto think that someone had turned his blood into molten lava. Despite that, he knew on instinct that the monster couldn't harm him now, that the great-tailed demon could no longer express his powers as he wished. Go ahead and revel in the affections of those piggish humans then, little hero of Konoha, until such time comes that you stand helpless as I consume them. Hero, the term still seemed odd, even though he had heard it more than once now. I begin to wonder about that, you'll have to get out of that cage first. I'm not quite sure I want you eating my village. Naruto blinked, not quite understanding his own words, wondering when he had begun to accept Konoha, the place he had so long hated and wanted to escape, as being his village. The demon wasn't the least bit amused, his growling voice changing into a low hiss. Rather than anger, the caged monster now seemed to be regarding the blonde with real hate. Perhaps he had hated Naruto all along, the Jinchuriki realized, and had intended to kill him once the blonde had served his purpose and secured the beast's return to the living realm. Not a chance in hell. Your village, imbecile. Your opinions mean nothing, so heed this warning. Fall back in line, or you will be the first to fill my stomach. The blonde snorted, seeing past the laughable attempt at intimidation. The greatest terror ever to exist had been reduced to a paper tiger, it was almost sad to see. With the cursed seal snatching whatever chakra the Biju tried to express in its evolved incarnation and giving Naruto control, there was nothing the Kitsune could do to challenge his prison. The Jinchuriki could see the beast slam against his cage in indignation, but what once might have caused his whole inner being to shake, now almost didn't even register. You think about things, and I think you'll learn that my opinions mean quite a bit more than nothing now. You're not in much position to issue such threats. Naruto willed the voice in his head to be silent and heard no more as he returned into the real world, still soaking in his bath and more revitalized than ever. For so long he had let the monster control his actions and opinions like a puppet, but the blonde could now see how he'd been manipulated, and would tolerate no more. A brilliant tactic, to be sure, approaching a broken child and giving him the companionship he'd craved, and receiving complete and total obedience in exchange. Orochimaru had done the exact same thing to Anko. That same snake had, through making his own bid to twist the blonde to his will, instead handed the Jinchuriki the one tool he needed to break the invisible chain binding him to the demon's will. Now he controlled the vessel's mutual potential, to use as he chose, through the cursed seal's chakra extraction power. I should send the old serpent a fruitcake or something, assuming he still has arms to receive it with. Making one last cleansing pass through his hair, Naruto drained the tub and strode over to his small bathroom mirror, taking a moment to admire his ness, looking at all the markings he'd accumulated over his career. The enormous scar on his chest was the most noticeable, something acquired in the toughest battle he'd ever experienced. Then were all his seals, the Shiku Fuanon located on his stomach, Orochimaru's Ten no Juin marring his N, and Manda's summoning contract mark showing on his chest, opposite the scar. A crimson Anbu tattoo stood alone on his bicep. Each one carried its own unique tale, as the spiked blonde Jinchuriki was marked up like a real veteran even at 13. A crisp knock then sounded at Naruto's apartment door, causing him to turn his head. A visitor, now that's rare. Maybe the mutt already found out about his sister. No, the container amended, Kiba would have busted down the door and come charging in raging and howling. Naruto slipped on some underwear and a loose cotton robe, and moved to answer the door. The blonde hesitated a second, and returned to his room to retrieve the kunai he kept on his nightstand. He doubted whether a potential assassin would be retarded enough to knock, or to attack at high noon, but stranger things had happened. Naruto held the blade in a position where whoever was waiting on the other side wouldn't be able to see it, and answered. Whoever he might have been expecting to see there, his unmasked vice captain wasn't high on the list. Azuki-san, this isn't a social call, I guess. Naruto hadn't ever seen Yugao without her mask and thick Anbu armor obscuring her look, and observed her as he stepped aside to let her into his modest apartment. The blonde wouldn't have even recognized her without the long, violet hair. She's beautiful. The Jinchuriki turned his attention back to the door, not wanting to be caught staring, concealing the kunai in his robe and hoping she hadn't noticed him brandishing a weapon. Relax, it's nothing work-related this time. No, I'm here because I need a new sparring partner. I haven't gotten a decent workout since Gecko-san's and I'm going to start rusting soon unless I get back into a routine. Naruto noticed her slight tongue slip, almost hinting at her close relationship with the Kenjutsu master, but was polite enough not to mention it. He knew well enough what the two had been. Still, he was curious as to the reason Yugao would come ask him to be her training partner. Naruto's swordsmanship was nowhere near stellar. He needed something to do regardless, so he wasn't about to complain, but that didn't mean he was going to give in without a little token resistance either. You know, I'm supposed to be on recuperative leave, Hokage's orders. Yugao looked at his chest, where his chest scar was poking out a little beneath his robe, when he moved into the apartment behind her. Unlike Anko's home, where random items were scattered all over the place, Naruto possessed little he didn't need. The blonde's walls were bare. Furniture and other accessories were at an absolute minimum, and weren't in the least extravagant where he did have them, and he owned almost no modern electronic appliances. Naruto's apartment was polished to a shine, and his possessions were organized into the proper places. He's not in the village at the moment, so I'm quite certain it'll be alright. You're not hurt, either, so no complaining. Now get dressed and let's go. Naruto shrugged, not all that surprised that the Sandaime was gone on business. Two rival villages had invaded their lands. It made sense that the Hokage would need to have a meeting with the Fire Lord to discuss what would be done in response. An all-out war looked to be looming on the horizon. The blonde wished that Sarutobi would have chosen him to be in his escort, but he had been wounded at the time. Alright, sure, don't get mad when I win, though. That comment managed to make the melancholic, serious woman smile a little. You haven't managed to beat me once to this point, Tensai, or perhaps we ought to place another little wager on the outcome. Naruto shook his blonde head in the negative, remembering their last bet and all the extra patrols he'd had to cope with as a result. I'll pass on that challenge, thanks. I haven't got much to see here, but go on and have a look around while I'm changing. The vessel returned to his bedroom and closed the door behind him, changing into a regular shirt and pants, and keeping the white robe on over them on a whim. Naruto might have removed the robe had he looked into a mirror, repulsed with the striking resemblance he now bore to the man who had sealed a biju into his stomach and consigned him to a monstrous childhood as a result. The Jinchuriki returned into his living room to see Yugao standing at the large cabinet he stored his small personal jutsu scroll collection inside, holding at the photograph on top in her hand, the sole tangible keepsake he had ever bothered to keep around. That was taken when I was 6, it's about all I've ever thought was worth keeping. The photograph was a simple one, a child Naruto standing with the Sandaime on the large terrace overlooking the Hokage monument, smiling while the old sage grinned into his pipe. That was back when the blonde still had something resembling childish innocence, back when he had been so oblivious and naive. The Anbu Kunoiki turned a little on hearing her teenage subordinate's voice, placing the picture back where she'd gotten it. You care quite a bit about the Lord Hokage, more than a sworn commander. Naruto shrugged again, never one to like discussing his emotions, even more so with a person he worked with. I was a poor orphan. Sandaime-sama was there to protect me when no one else would lend me a hand, and he gave me this chance to become something. I owe him more than mere words could ever tell. Yugao's sharp black orbs seemed to see right through his understatement. She knew at once that the blonde's regard towards the venerable Cage ran much deeper than some mundane personal obligation, but chose not to press him into revealing his genuine emotions. The vice captain understood quite well that there were certain things that people would rather keep private. You did well to protect the Lord Hokage, no matter what our captain said. And he believes so too, even though he assigned that punishment. Naruto scratched his chin in embarrassment and glanced at his bare wall. Ah, enough with all this mush, come on, let's go hit each other with wooden swords. The violet-haired woman almost smirked back. Ha, with pleasure, but I'm going to be the one doing all the hitting, Uzumaki. And with that, the two Anbu went out into the village towards the training grounds. XXXXXXXXXX. Over a week had now passed since the attempted invasion, and things were beginning to return to normal within Konoha. The carnival atmosphere that had accompanied their overwhelming success in the battle was dissipating. The weather outside was cold, as expected in late November, which made the hot springs seem so much more inviting as Yuhi Kurenai relaxed nude in the steaming waters. With her was Yamanaka Ino, the last remaining student on her original Genin cell. Missions were still postponed while the Hokage continued to meet with the Fire Lord and his counselors. The Sandaime was scheduled to return tomorrow, to announce the Grand Council's decision. MMH, this water is like being in heaven, sensei. Kurenai smiled, arching her back against the warm rock she was leaned against. We'll start our mental exercises once we've had a good soak. For learning advanced genjutsu, a clear mind is crucial. Now that Ino was her sole remaining student, Kurenai had decided to begin training the girl in the more advanced illusion arts. The genjutsu mistress did harbor considerable regret concerning Kiba, who she had in essence given over to Kakashi when the man had asked. However, she remained convinced that the arrangement would be to the Inuzuka's advantage in the long run. Kiba was the sort who needed a strong rival to motivate him to push his training to the limit, and with Naruto long since gone into Anbu now, the animal trainer wouldn't receive that much needed motivation on Team 8. The Uchiha kid would be able to replace the blonde in that role, and Kakashi was a much better choice to instruct him regardless, being a more battle-experienced and well-rounded warrior than Kurenai, as well as an expert tracker with his own nin dogs. Her talent was in illusions, and Inuzuka Kiba had little to no potential or interest in the subtle art. I wish Kiba was still with us, though, I don't like him being on Forehead's team. And Naruto-kun too. Ino seemed to sink into the water, burrowing down in the steaming warmth to her chin. As do I, but those two have their own paths to walk now, Naruto in particular. Naruto, with him gone, their team was short-handed regardless, and that was the main reason Kurenai was willing to hand Kiba over to Kakashi, at least while Team 7's last member recovered, which would be a long and arduous process given what she had managed to hear about his condition. Now, the Inuzuka would be in a complete team again, and would be prepared to pass the Chunin exams next time around. Kiba had the SKS, and Kurenai believed that poor luck was to blame in his not making it past the preliminaries. Kiba was good, but Rock Lee was a good bit better, among the best competing in those exams. Against a somewhat lesser scared opponent, her bestial student might have advanced. With the proper motivation to continue his hard work, next time he would pass. Naruto was on a whole other level besides, and could well have gone against all the other candidates at the same time and won, had he remained in the competition rather than moonlighting in the Hokage's honor guard in his new mask. I knew the team wouldn't be together long, but I'd hoped it would be a little longer. Ino on the other hand, needed more molding, Kurenai realized with a sigh. The girl had won her match in the preliminaries while Kiba had lost, to be sure, but had managed to succeed owing to sheer grit and determination, rather than potent SK. The Yamanaka's surprising toughness was admirable, and had shown that she had the potential, but would not serve her well outside a monitored exam battle environment, against an opponent that wouldn't waste time as her exam opponent had. That she had maimed a Konoha nin mattered little to the crimson-gazed woman. Kurenai had seen actual teammates shred one another apart in past exam matches. Her intention was now to train Ino as much as possible, giving her individual instruction and her undivided attention, at least until the Genin squad arrangements were scrambled again with the last exams promotions. One or more Konoha candidates were sure to be advanced to Chunin rank. The teams would be changed around in so that the remaining Genin could compete again in the next exams as well. Whether the girl would still be under her charge then, Kurenai couldn't know. I still can't believe what I heard, that he beat Orochimaru and saved the Hokage. Kurenai might not have believed it either, had she not witnessed the events in person, or known Naruto and his potential to make the impossible happen. She, Asuma, Kakashi, Guy and countless others had been standing there helpless, able to do nothing but look on in horror as Orochimaru maimed their Hokage in combat, using a most abominable kinjutsu to resurrect Shodai-sama and Nadaime-sama and twist the two great heroes to his will. For Asuma it had been like a living hell. She knew her man well enough to see that beneath his best attempts to remain calm, he was still the third's last living son, no matter how strained the relations between them. The winter air's bite stung Kurenai as she gazed into the overcast skies, recalling the strange events, splashing a little hot spring water onto her NB with an idle hand motion. He did, Ino, believe me, and I was there and saw it all. The woman didn't elaborate much, leaving Ino and her ever-present gossip network to iron out the events in her own mind as she might. To be quite honest, Kurenai was somewhat hesitant to ponder that battle more than she had to, not wanting to consider the monstrous creature Naruto had changed into when he'd soared into battle like an avenging spirit, battling despite with a mortal wound that should have killed him, but didn't even slow him in the least. He had been a demon in appearance, but still the same Naruto beneath. At least the villagers were mostly still under the sleeping genjutsu. There would have been trouble had the civilians seen that Naruto looking like a living monster, his saving the Hokage and the whole village aside. The shinobi showed a little more gratitude, having seen the real horrors out there. When the villagers had regained consciousness in large part, the battle had been won. The pariah Naruto had become Konoha's new hero, and was not in the least sure how to handle with his new position, Kurenai mused with a small smile, which soon turned into a scowl when she remembered who had been there to hop right onto his bandwagon. Just like your sensei, Anko, taking them young. And to think I called you a friend. Anko's getting the kid, her own student, drunker than a skunk and using him to quench her disgusting whims, roping Kiba's older sister into her twisted game. The entire perverse situation was enough to make the Kunoichi sick with indignant rage. Kurenai had no illusions whatsoever about what had happened when that odd trio had staggered into the streets that night. She'd been both relieved and still a little stung when Naruto had noticed her and Asuma together, and hadn't seemed to care a whit. The genjutsu mistress knew well enough about the crush her one-time student had harbored towards her, but had never been able to summon the resolve to pull him aside and let him down as she should have, guarding that little connection she still had to the blonde. In her own mind, as long as Naruto continued to nurse some attraction towards her, he wouldn't be lost to her, or to their team. Kurenai wasn't interested in him as a lover. He was 13, but she also didn't want the blonde to vanish like the wind and leave her, and his other teammates, in his wake, and that was the reason it hurt her a little to see that he was no longer interested. Kurenai-sensei. Kurenai blinked, looking at Ino and cursing inside at being so thoughtless. Gomen, I must have been spacing out a little. The thin blonde girl gave an uncaring shrug and pointed into the skies. Like I said, that's got to be the biggest bird I've ever seen. The older Kunoichi squinted, gazing towards where Ino was pointing. She also saw a humongous bird careening through the air, but something wasn't quite right. The bird glided much too low to the ground, swooping around in circles and then pulling higher into the clouds. Kurenai would have considered chasing the weird thing, but she was stark in the onsen and the strange avian creature was leaving her sight even then. A gentle buzzing sound reached her ears, and her crimson gaze swiveled back over in time to see several smaller hummingbirds twittering about in the air where the larger creature had been. As one passed overhead, she noticed something peculiar. That's no natural creature, that almost looked like. Recognition snapped into her mind, as she recalled once reading in Konoha's bingo book about some Iwa missing nin who could shape high-caliber explosives into living bombs, and tended to use an animal theme in doing so. Kurenai couldn't recall the man's name on the spot, but he was well known to have been linked to several notorious terrorist organizations as a hired bomber, and was considered armed and lethal enough to merit an S-class ranking. Further consideration was halted as the small hummingbirds careened towards the stress points on the wooden building next to them, as well as the onsen walls. Kurenai pulled her exposed student down into the hot water as countless eardrum-shattering explosions rang out in the air all around them, showering wood splinters and stone shards all over. Konoha was under assault once more, this time with its Hokage absent. That will be all for this video. Be sure to like, subscribe, share, and comment down below for more videos. Goodbye.